Today, we got the Mayor of Toronto. I'm a big supporter of the Mayor. He's been a friend of mine for a long time. I've known him for over 30 years. He's in politics for the right reason.
As the 65th Mayor of Toronto, you have made tremendous and significant changes to improve Toronto's transit systems throughout the past few years. You have implemented action plans to reduce commute times by extending subway lines to Vaughan, expanding the LRT, and as part of Smart Track, you have implemented a plan to enhance the use of GO train lines to serve those in Toronto. In a recent interview with CP24, you expressed your plan to apply pressure on leaders within the province to commit funding towards a relief line in Toronto while making it a priority. The city and the province have funded the cost for the design stage of the relief line. However, how will the city and the province look to fund the construction of the relief line?
Well, that is a very current question because I had a meeting with the Premier this morning at City Hall, and that was the #1 topic on the agenda, and we addressed it together at a press conference. And what I said was very simply this: for the reasons that I mentioned a moment ago when it comes to how tax money is collected by the different levels of government, if we are left with a situation where only the federal government and ourselves are expected to pay for the relief line, it will be very difficult for us to finance the construction of that. At the present time, through the establishment of their transit fund, the federal government has committed an envelope of funding, it's about $5 billion, to our second phase of transit projects. The first phase are things that are underway now. The second phase includes the relief line. What has not happened as yet, and the federal government has the expectation that the provinces, plural, including Ontario, will match the money that they have put forward. And they've said they will insist on a matching of at least 33.33%. The preferred number is 40%. So this morning at the meeting with the Premier, I was saying to her that we need them to commit to that simply because, first of all, it doesn't make any sense to me that they would put up their share of the $100 million plus that we are spending altogether on the design and planning. Why would you pay to design and plan something you're not going to build? But I said, we need the certainty now because that line is urgent. And we're moving forward with it as rapidly as we can, but we certainly need to know they're going to be partners in the construction. And so she didn't answer my question this morning. She said to the media, I don't want to put words in her mouth, you can look it up, but she said, you know, we're finalizing some of our arrangements with regard to both our election platform and our budget. She didn't mention the election platform, but so I guess I'm just awaiting an answer, but I certainly put the request to her this morning. It's not the first time I put it forward, but I said, you know, time is marching on, and I said to her that my job on behalf of the people of Toronto is to hold all the party leaders to account and ask them specifically, will you fund these projects, including the relief line? And I am in the process of doing so. We obviously don't know who the new PC leader is going to be yet, but I asked her this morning, I've asked her before, and the NDP leader has already said that she will commit herself and her party, if they form government, to a 1/3 share of the transit project. So that's where we stand as of 11 o'clock this morning.
My question is very similar to the last one. It's just about the current state of the Smart Track project. After findings from a Metrolinx report showed that the 3 Smart Track stations planned for outside the downtown core will have low or even negative ridership. And another controversial topic is that part of the project, is that what's going to be the fare for that for the Smart Track?
Where are you with Smart Track? You made a promise.
Smart Track, for those who don't know, was something that was formed an important part of my election platform. And it was on a fairly simple premise. As some of you will know, GO train tracks run throughout the city, but they've principally been used over time to carry people from outside of the city of Toronto to downtown. And only in rare instances did the trains actually stop in Toronto and pick people up and transport them inside the city. I felt this was, in light of the huge need that we have, and the huge need we have on an urgent basis, that it was going to be sensible for us to make much greater use of those tracks inside the city. So if you wish to travel from Scarborough to Union Station, or vice versa, that you would have an option of using these tracks, and it allows you to do that without building a subway, which takes a long time, without digging tunnels. It's cheaper because those tracks are there. And so the province and ourselves and the federal government, we've actually come a long way on that from something that was an election concept where we didn't have teams of engineers and cost accountants to help us figure it out. We've now got the funding in place. The city is going to put up about $1 billion, just over $1 billion of this. The province is putting up quite a lot because they're electrifying the train lines and building some extra tracks. We're essentially paying for the cost of the extra stations that will be located inside the city of Toronto entirely. And so you will now be able to, on a much wider basis, be able to get on at one place in the city of Toronto and ride on effectively what we call a GO train today to somewhere else in the city, so that the travel will take place entirely inside the city. The business cases that you were referring to, yes, looked, and of course, when they look at one station versus another, some produce more benefits than others, and some have different costs than others. But if you started looking at every transit project that way, some of you are familiar enough with the subway system that you use to know that some subway stops, lots of people get on and off, and other places they don't. But nobody's talking about closing those subway stops down, because you have to have subway stops at a reasonable distance from one another and in reasonable places. The key here is that the overall Smart Track project and all the stations taken together produce far more in the way of benefits than they do have costs. And that's what this business case said, and that's the way you have to look at these things. And the Smart Track is also part of a transit network plan we have, which includes the Relief Line, the Scarborough East LRT, and so on, the Scarborough Subway Extension. So I'm very confident that Smart Track, first of all, is going to be able to get done faster. It will provide relief somewhere between 10% and 20% for the Yonge Street subway line, because people will now have another way of getting downtown other than just using the Yonge Street and Bloor Street subways, and that it is going to be done on quite a cost-effective basis relative to even, say, the cost of the Relief Line. The Relief Line is about an $8 billion project. I mean, these are very expensive projects, and so I'm very happy with how it's going, and that we've made huge progress on it in the first 3 years of my tenure, and that it's going to happen. I'm going tonight to a Smart Track public consultation meeting where we're consulting people on the service levels, on exactly how the stations are, going to be configured, and all that kind of very detailed thing as a prelude to, I think, later this year, actually putting the stations out for competitive bid. So who's going to build them and for how much money? And I think you asked a question about the fare, and the intention is, and we're engaged in discussions again as recently as this morning with the Premier, that the intention is that the Smart Track cost will be the same cost as the TTC fare, so that you will make it attractive for people to choose between using the TTC or Smart Track. There'll be no sort of cost disadvantage to one versus the other, so that it will provide a genuine alternative to take some of the pressure off the Yonge Street subway, because the Relief Line is not scheduled to be finished. Even if we can speed it up, the current date is 2031. If we can speed it up, let's say it's a couple of years earlier than that, we're going to certainly try. But that's still quite a long ways away, where Smart Track is probably 5 years earlier than that, just because the train tracks are there, and you just have to sort of electrify them, and it's not simple, but it's simpler.
Okay, so in recent news, there has been much advocacy to support the Yonge Street Bike Lane project, a plan that would reduce the number of driving lanes north of Shepherd to allow for space for a raised bike path. As an advocate for road safety, do you believe that this is the best option for reducing traffic-related deaths and create a better infrastructure with improved sidewalks, cycling areas, and greenery? If not, how do you believe the enhanced Yonge and transform Beecroft plan will excel in comparison?
Well, first of all, when I sought the office, again, I think I've been entirely consistent in saying that I believe we should have more safe, separated bike lanes, separated wherever we can. Separated meaning, as you know, that there's actually some kind of buffer that's there between the roadway and the bicycle lane. So like on Adelaide or Richmond or some of the other streets I'm sure you're familiar with. But I said that they would be put, where appropriate, because I don't think you just sort of say you're going to have them everywhere for a whole bunch of reasons. On the Yonge Street plan in particular, and so as a result, I stood, firm on Bloor Street with respect to what was a pilot project, now voted to be made permanent, for those bike lanes in that stretch that you may be familiar with not too far from here, because I believe that was a sensible place to do it. It was well thought through, and the pilot proved to be successful, both in terms of the bicycle traffic, in terms of cars still being able to move, in terms of business. While they had some temporary dislocation, I think that they were recovering from it. So I stood very firm in supporting that. I've been very firm in supporting a different kind of project on King Street to try and move transit vehicles. So I look at these things on a case-by-case basis. The proposal or the alternative proposal that I support in North Yonge Street, which is up at Yonge and Shepherd, it's in that area, Yonge and 401, which, by the way, is one of the most traffic congested areas of the entire city at present, is that you would build the bicycle lanes. So the proposal that I support gives you bike lanes. It gives you beautified public realm, meaning sidewalks and that kind of space. It gives you a reconstructed street, but it keeps all the lanes of traffic. It doesn't take them away in one of the most traffic congested areas of the city. And I just believe it is a more sensible proposal in the context of trying to address everybody's needs. And I've said many times before in response to those from the bike community who've frankly been quite harsh in their criticism of me because I didn't accept their preferred proposal, that my job as the mayor is to balance the interests of all the different people that are affected, not to be the chief spokesperson or chief advocate for any particular group. And that in this case, I think we have a win-win-win where we get bike lanes on Beecroft. And Beecroft, for those who don't know the geography, is a street that runs a very, very short block to the west and runs all the way up parallel to Yonge Street. So you can have bike lanes there, which I'm happy and enthusiastic about putting there, and they've said it can be done. You get the public realm improvements to the sidewalks and other areas, and I've even said I'm quite willing to look at a proposal that talks about narrowing the traffic lanes down to some extent in order to provide for more sidewalk space, and there are ways in which you can do that. And you get the traffic lanes maintained, which to me, at least in the short term, is probably the sensible thing to do. And so I support that option, but it allows for everybody to have something that they wish. Better public realm, traffic that continues to move, and bike lanes that are safe on a street that's just a very short distance to the west. Like you could walk it in 1 minute, 2 minutes.
Like it's been mentioned in the past, you've been focusing a lot on the infrastructure and transit, like the King Street project. However, with a city as large as Toronto, there's only the Don Valley Parkway, which is the only expressway that runs north and south in and out of the downtown core. Do you have any plans to ease some of the congestion on the Don Valley Parkway and improve overall traffic flow in and out of the city?
Well, I'll deal with that in two parts. In terms of the Don Valley Parkway, the best thing I can do to try and ease traffic on the Don Valley Parkway is to build more public transportation and give people a proper alternative to get out of their cars. I think one of the reasons now you find so many people on the Don Valley Parkway is because they don't have a convenient, affordable alternative to take public transportation to wherever they need to go. And so if you look at the transit network plan that we have had approved by City Council under my administration, that we're now in the process of getting the money for from all the different governments, including ourselves, that is going to make a big difference. So once you have something like Smart Track, not only are you going to provide for people who live inside the city to take transit instead of taking the parkway, because just like we have, to your point, just like we have one parkway, we have one Yonge Street subway line. One of the things we have not done in this city, and I'm glad we didn't do it with expressways, but I'm not glad we didn't do it with subways, is to build redundancy. If you go to New York or London, they will have parallel subway lines. And this is one of the problems we have when we close them down to do very much needed rebuilding and putting in new signal systems and so on. We have to close it. And of course, when you close it, or even when you have an emergency on a given day, that's it. That's the one subway line that goes north-south. So we didn't do that with expressways either, but we're not going to start with that now. I mean, that's not the right way to think. I mean, the right way to think is that you are going to provide adequate and much better public transportation such that people will say, you know what, I want to leave my car at home. And that includes not only the people I was referring to that live inside the city, but also the people who live outside the city, in the 905 and who come here to work or go to school or whatever. With respect to traffic moving inside the city, and making that flow of traffic move better on other streets than the Parkway, we are doing everything we can. It's difficult. It's a very challenging thing that I said I was going to try and make a difference on. And I think in a rapidly growing city, in some respects, you sort of think you're doing well to stay even because there's so many more people coming to Toronto every year, and many of them end up driving cars. So we're using technology. So we've installed, for the first time ever in Toronto, genuine, advanced smart technology. It's actually traffic signals that read the flow of traffic. So it would, for example, never have you in that situation that we've all been in where you're sitting at a red light and the street in front of you that has the green light that's going back and forth in front of you has no traffic on it. You're thinking, well, why am I sitting at this red light when there's no traffic going across? It's just because it's on some timer that changes it. And so this would actually have the traffic signals read what's going on with traffic, and they're actually being installed now on 2 major streets so that we can see how they work, and then we're quite prepared to make a big additional investment. We have traffic wardens that we're putting in place, which are people that are less expensive than police officers, but who will be able to direct traffic so that we can get some of the worst places in the city, including where those bike lanes were proposed for on Yonge Street, and actually direct the traffic, because sometimes something as simple as somebody actually directing traffic helps it to move better. We have retimed all the signals across the city. We have enforcement blitzes where people who inconsiderately and ridiculously park in lanes of traffic during rush hour are towed away because it's just inconsiderate behavior, and it's very clear from the signs you're not allowed to do it. And people just run in for a cup of coffee to Starbucks or just to get their laundry, and meantime inconvenience hundreds of other people. So we're doing some of those things that are some very simple and old-fashioned, others more using technology to try and get the traffic moving better, but the answer is not to build more expressways. I have said that I think we need to maintain some of the expressways we have, because they form, most cities, as you probably know in the world, and many of you will have traveled, have a ring road that sort of goes around the city of some kind or other, and we have one. It consists of the Parkway, the 401, the 427, and the Gardiner, and it forms a way that you don't have to come into the city if you're trying to, go around the city or go someplace in that manner. And I believe that we need to maintain that to keep cars actually out of the city, and have them go where they need to go. But no more expressways are contemplated. I don't think it's even physically practical.
You're going to toll the road or charge
Well, I
people to
tried.
come
I
and
mean,
down?
I believe that we needed to raise the money. I've referred earlier on to the share of transit and how it's paid for. So let's say it was done on the 40-40-20, provincial, federal 40 each, and us 20. We still have to raise our 20, and the most effective way to do that is not necessarily through property taxes for the reasons I was mentioning earlier on. It's a regressive tax. And so I thought a fair way to do it was to toll the Gardiner Expressway and the Don Valley Parkway, not only because it's roads where there is a cost to keeping them up for the benefit of those drivers, but also because a great many of the people who use the Parkway and the Gardiner are people who live outside of the city of Toronto, and it's our responsibility to entirely finance, at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars, I should tell you, the ongoing maintenance over time of those roads. And I felt it was appropriate, if you put a modest toll on, that the people who lived in the 905 as well, outside of Toronto, would pay a bit of that share. But as you know, having been encouraged to introduce those tolls by the Government of Ontario then turned around when I said, okay, I'm doing it, will you please just sign off? They said no, they wouldn't sign off. So we had to abandon that, and they gave us, sort of as a consolation prize, some additional gas tax revenues, which will help to pay for transit, because the entire proceeds of those road tolls were going to go to build transit. So to speak to the question that you asked, all the money from the road tolls was going to go to build transit, so that we could, in effect, say, this is the way we make the Parkway better and discourage people from using their cars. In 2018, for climate change reasons, for stress reasons, for economic reasons, we cut down on the traffic congestion by using the road tolls, but we weren't allowed to bring them in. So that's where it sits at the moment.
So the 2018 budget has been criticized and called a fairy tale budget by many. One particular group, as Ralph mentioned, was the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty group. They were complaining about how less of the budget was allocated to shelter support and housing. Only $142.41 out of the $2,907 had been allocated to shelter support and housing. Since you're widely recognized for your community work, what are your views on this, and how would you address this issue?
Well, first of all, I can just say what they're saying is not true, and they are people who are not to be negotiated with, not to have rational discussions with. They are people that once had a riot at Queen's Park a number of years ago, and they literally had a riot as a way of saying that they were unhappy with government policy. So, but having said all that, let's talk about the facts. I mean, the facts are that there were substantial increases out of the budget, for example, allocated in the case of the repair of Toronto community housing, where some of the most vulnerable people in Toronto live. For the first time ever in the history of the city, there's a line item in the capital budget of the city to allocate substantial amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, to go to repair that housing, as opposed to simply relying on either not doing the repairs or relying on the other governments to come forward with the money. I have been campaigning hard to get money from the other governments to help us with those repairs, because over the years, long before I got to be mayor, a backlog had built up in those repairs of $2 billion plus. And if you went to see some of that housing, as I've done many times as recently as this week, you would find it profoundly unacceptable that we suggest that some of our fellow citizens who are struggling should be living in housing that's in a poor state of repair like that. So we've actually been doing the repairs. This year we'll do about $250 million of repairs. Secondly, we committed ourselves in the budget and funded it to build 1,000 new shelter beds, because we have had an issue this year. It's been a very difficult year in terms of increasing demand for shelter space. I will tell you that there's a number of factors contributing to that. It's been difficult because the weather earlier on, as you might remember, was extreme. But also it's things like refugees. And I say that not to place any blame on the refugees. I'm a huge supporter and have been through my time as mayor in making sure that we welcome people, as we've done successfully in this country for generations. But at the same time, I will tell you that at this moment in time, of the shelter space we have, about 30% of it is occupied by refugees. That's not a good place for them to be. Because they're not going to be as able to integrate into Toronto society and Toronto's economy and so on if they're in a shelter, as opposed to being in housing. I would say that more than half the people that are in the shelters are people that are suffering from some kind of mental illness or addiction problem. And they're not getting the treatment they need in a shelter. They need supportive housing. So we are actually allocating increased funds, and what they said, that whatever that ratio was they gave is some number that they've pulled out that sort of is trying to put a very bad spin on what is actually a very significant increased investment that we made in housing repairs for social housing, in shelters, in affordable housing. I'll give you another example. Affordable housing, the government of the City of Toronto in 2009 set a target for itself of approving, and you'll think, and you're correct, this number is not adequate, but they set the target of saying we should approve, as a city council, 1,000 new units of affordable rental housing every year. Not 1 year between 2009 and 2017 was that target met before I became mayor, and the first year we actually met it. We came close last year. This year we exceeded it. And that's only because we put an extra effort and money into the contribution we have to make to that affordable housing. So when I hear this criticism, I look, we can do more, and we need to do more, and we need more help from the other governments. But the notion that we haven't done more, and just on anti-poverty generally, I will tell you that in the budget this year, for example, for the first time ever, we are going to have a low-income fare equity pass to allow people who are either on disability or who are low-income people to have a discounted transit fare. First time ever that it's happened. We froze TTC fares. The first year of my administration allowed kids under 12 to ride free. And you may think, well, what's that have to do with poverty? For a lot of families that end up spending upwards of 20% of their income, if they have a large number of children, on transporting their children around one place or another because they don't have a car or because it's just better for them to use transit, that's made a big difference to them, especially the poorest people, obviously, among them. And so I could go on about the student nutrition programs and so on, but no matter what we do within the context of trying to fight poverty, which I'm very serious about doing, with that group, it wouldn't be enough no matter what. And so you just have to accept that as part of I'm a big boy, and you accept that as part of the reality of being in public life, is that there are people like that who don't really even want to sit down and talk about it. I mean, unless you do what they say, then, otherwise whatever else you're doing is wrong.
Have you made any progress in 4 years getting the 2 other levels of government?
Yes. Okay. With respect to the provincial government, they've allocated about $250 or $300 million. They've narrowly focused it on energy retrofitting, which is not bad, but we need it to be a little more flexible than that. But there's a lot of work on these repairs that have to be done for things like new windows and so on that qualify for energy retrofitting as part of their climate change plan. And so that was up from zero. Okay. We were getting zero before. Okay. From the federal government, as part of their $11 billion commitment over the next 10 years for housing across the country, we are going to get a share. The only, I don't want to say complaint, the only observation I would make in that regard is that the money really doesn't start flowing seriously until next year. So when they announced it starting to flow seriously next year, a little tiny bit this year. So again, they weren't really contributing at all before, so I'm happy they're stepping up and starting to take a role in this. The city is still bearing a disproportionate share of the burden of what was a $2 billion repair backlog is now down, I think, to just under $2 billion as we work it down. But the fact is we're making the repairs, and it's necessary both for the dignity of the people who live there, but if you think about it, there's a business case as well. We, the public, you own those houses, so why would you ever let them fall down to a state of disrepair to the point where when I came to office, we were actually having to close units down because they were so far gone. In fact, I went out and announced at one development in Etobicoke that we were going to spend the money to renovate them, and when they went in to start the renovations and took the walls apart and so on, they came back and said, these houses should not be renovated because they're so far gone that it's just not sensible to do it. And so those are having to be closed and redeveloped. And that had happened in a lot of cases because of, frankly, the negligence of previous governments, plural, where nobody got together and decided they were going to spend the money to repair these in a timely fashion. And like your own house or your own car, if you just left your car and never fixed it and drove it and drove it and drove it, eventually it's going to break down and be worth nothing because they can't fix it. And so we're working at that now. But the money this year, back to the question at the back there, that's been allocated for Toronto Community Housing allows me to say that as compared to a projection that was made by them that we'd have to close 400 units of housing in a city desperately short of housing this year, we will have to close none because we are going to actually repair the housing in time for it not to be closed. And my objective was not to close units down when we're short. It just makes sense.
So the Regent Park revitalization project is something that I've kept a close eye towards. With the revitalization at the end stages, my question to you is why haven't priority neighborhoods in Scarborough, where I'm from, gotten the same type of major revitalization as Regent Park?
Well, it's a good question, but one that we're working on, because what has to happen, the revitalization of Regent Park took place in the following context, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with Regent Park, but it was probably the largest single public housing development in Canada, and it was built in the 1950s on what they thought was a good idea at the time, which was to build these kind of low-rise housing communities that were built around a kind of a courtyard. They kind of turned their backs on the street. There were no streets running through them, which they thought was going to be peaceful for families and so on. It turned out over time that it wasn't wise. We've sort of learned about how cities work best, which is when there's actually life on the streets and there's people in stores and so on. It was also kind of created into kind of a wasteland when it came to things like food and so on. There was no supermarket at Regent Park, so that even that sort of thing wasn't happening, so it made it very hard for people to get good food. So when Regent Park was revitalized, it was very much done in partnership. First of all, to make sure you created a mixed income community so that you would develop side by side market rent buildings, so people who could afford to pay market rent, market condo buildings, so people who could afford to buy a condo, and public housing all in one neighborhood, whereas before it was all public housing. And it also goes against this notion that I think today we now understand that it is not good or right or appropriate to put all low-income people together. It's better to have people in a mixed income kind of neighborhood. And so Regent Park, I would defy many of you to walk with me down there and say, okay, point out to me which one of those buildings is the public housing building, which one is the market condo, and which one is the market rental building, because they are all of equality. But it required us to have a partnership with the private sector to do that, because somebody in the private sector had to build the condos and sell them. Same with the market rent buildings, whereas we are the ones that operate the housing that is for people who have a subsidized rent in effect. And so it isn't as simple as just kind of going and saying we're going to do it. We have to go and find the partners. We have to go through a competitive process. We have to, do the planning and so forth. So we're now doing it in Regent Park, and that's got 2 phases left to go. If you go down there, you'll see there's 2 places of land where the land has been cleared of the old housing, and they're just building now the new housing, and there's still 2 more phases to go after that. We're doing it in a place called Lawrence Heights, which is a neighborhood up at the Allen Expressway in Lawrence, up in that sort of middle part of town, southern North York. We're doing it at Alexandra Court downtown. And we're now going to be looking, and even in the place that I mentioned in Etobicoke, where we had to stop doing the renovations and effectively have to revitalize that, we're going to be going to look for a partner to do that with us. So the answer is we are now going, now that we had to sort of establish that the Regent Park model worked, and we had to establish that it worked for our benefit, to know it worked for us, but also that the private sector people would say it worked for them, because otherwise who's going to come and partner with you? And you need people to come and partner to build the condos next to the rental units, next to the public housing, and then everybody lives in one neighborhood. And guess what? In Regent Park, it's attracted a grocery store and a bank. I mean, Regent Park, which housed thousands of people, never even had a bank before now. Never had a bank. I mean, imagine that there was just no bank there. You had to go somewhere else to do your banking. So we're going to be doing much more of that, I hope, and the idea is to go out now and say to the private sector people who would like to come and partner with us on projects that are outside of the downtown area.
How do you incentivize other developers so that they're willing to take the risk?
Well, there are other people besides Mitch, and he's been terrific, and Daniels Corporation, which is the name of the company he runs that is the partner with us in Regent Park, have been wonderful corporate citizens, and they've done way beyond just being the developer. They also were key contributors. I mean, sometime if you're interested in this kind of thing, you should go down to Regent Park and just walk through the neighborhood and see what's there. And you can see the old housing, some of it's still there. And you can see the state that it's in, and some people are still living in it. You can see the new housing, but you can also see what else went in there besides the bank and the supermarket. A wonderful aquatic center, a wonderful community center, a fabulous arts center. So that neighborhood, I would now say that housed and still houses some of the people who are struggling the most in the whole city, has what they should have, which is the very best facilities to help give them and their kids the best chance to actually sort of, lift themselves up. And that's done largely not through the money entirely of the Daniels Corporation, but they certainly showed leadership in making it all happen. And we found at least one other developer that's doing Lawrence Heights with us, different developer. But the key now is to sort of find as many of these public-spirited people who are also ingenious, because they're going to use the ingenuity of the private sector to find ways to build these communities, and they do well and we do well in the sense we get more public housing at a reasonable cost. And that's challenging for us, but we're going to do it. But they've done a magnificent job. This Daniels Corporation is something to be admired by all of us who think that that is part of your responsibility when you are a profit-making business, is not just to make lots of money. I want them to make lots of money, because then they pay tax on that, and that goes to build transit and pay for housing. But I also want them to use their ingenuity and their their status as a corporate citizen to do things to advance the interests of the city. Because think about it, that's in their best interest at the end of the day too, as well as ours. Because, you know, it makes the projects they do more valuable as the City of Toronto, for example, gets healthier downtown. You know, if it's healthy downtown, there aren't as many people that are poor, there aren't as, you know, everything generally improves. That's in everybody's best interest, without exception.
You may have known that as of January 1st, 2018, there have been new mortgage rules that have been implemented, which states that home buyers with a down payment of 20% or more will now be subject to stricter qualifying criteria, also known as the stress test. So that would determine whether a home buyer would be able to afford their principal and interest payments should the interest rates increase. Due to this rule, it makes it hard for many people to mortgage their house. So what is your take on this rule, and how does this rule make housing affordable when people can't afford to get mortgage done?
Well, it's a very good question, and I don't think we're going to know what the impact of it is for some time yet. But I'm told by people in the banking industry they were largely doing something almost equivalent to this anyway, because if you think about it from their standpoint, aside from the government's interest in making sure that you don't get a lot of people who take on debt over their head, you know, and then if interest rates change, they have to, you saw what happened in the US, you know, where people took on a lot of debt, and then when circumstances changed, you know, they had to have their houses foreclosed upon. It was a disaster. I mean, people just walked away from their homes because they had no choice. And so we don't ever want a situation like that. In fact, we came through that recession in 2009 and 2008 better because we had stricter rules here. But the banks themselves, as a matter of protecting their own interests, were looking at those kinds of numbers anyway and saying, all right, before we lend Ralph Lean this money, what would happen to Ralph Lean's numbers, because they go through what I referred to earlier, especially for young people, this very precise budgeting when they tell you how much they will lend you. But they have to ask themselves the question, well, would that loan still be good in our books, the banks, if interest rates were up 2%? And so the government really institutionalized that or put it into the regulations to force them to do it. And so I think it has led, you're correct, to some people, based on what I've heard early in the year, because they just came into effect, being turned down for mortgages. But, you know, we have an interest in this too, frankly, because right now we take in as a city $800 million out of our $10 billion, $11 billion this year operating budget from what is called the land transfer tax, the municipal land transfer tax. And so, you know, aside from the issues that might confront people who are trying to buy a house, if people stop buying houses and selling houses, buying them in particular is when we collect the tax, that's going to affect our city finances, and we have to, by law, run a balanced budget. So if we fell $100 million short out of that $800 million on land transfer tax, it would cause us, you know, to have to take some measures to adjust for that. So we're watching it all very carefully, but I think what the federal government is really trying hard to do is to make sure, on the one hand, that the Toronto market, real estate market, and Vancouver, but Toronto and Vancouver are the two that have shown a lot of signs of heating up, don't get overheated, but at the same time not to sort of damage the real estate market, to kind of just cool it off a little bit, and also make sure people are protected, you know, from a disaster befalling their family because they took on a mortgage they shouldn't have taken on if there was a possibility interest rates might go up, say, by 2%. And that's possible. They've gone up, I think, by maybe, close to 1% in the last little while. And it sounds stupid when you say 1%. You know, it's going to go up, but 1% or 2% actually can make a lot of difference to the monthly charges to a person who's on an income that is very close to the line in terms of their ability to pay for their housing. So I don't know what the impact's going to be, and I hope it's not severe. I hope what it does is just kind of keeps things in a reasonably calm sort of fashion and doesn't kind of adjust, you know, cause too many adjustments one way or the other. But we'll have to see.
Mayor Tory, the stigma and stereotypes Black Ontarians and communities face have impacted public policies, decision-making, and services. As a result, in nearly every measure of opportunity, security, and fairness in our society, anti-Black racism is felt. In December 2017, you publicly acknowledged the existence of anti-Black racism in Toronto. Black children are more likely to be in foster care or enrolled in lower academic streams. Black men are more likely to interact with the justice system than their white counterparts at all levels of society. Black women are more likely than white women to be unemployed or underemployed despite having higher levels of education. 8.8% of Black women with university degrees are unemployed compared to 5.7% of white women with only high school diplomas. Other immigrant communities have come to Toronto, built their own closed communities, and thrived. My people, unfortunately, have not been able to create the same economic power for ourselves. What do you attribute anti-Black racism to? How can it be actively reduced on a day-to-day basis. Recommendations, plans, and strategies are great. Implementation and application is much better.
I agree, and I will repeat to you today what I said in launching a process that led to the development of and implementation of and budgeting for an anti-Black racism plan for the City of Toronto, first one we've ever had. And it was just passed, as you pointed out, in December and funded in the budget for 2018, the first year of the program. And it consists of, and I'm not going to remember it all from memory now, but it consists of addressing most of the areas that you talked about. So it goes all the way from job opportunities and making sure those are taken directly to some of the people that are suffering from the higher rates of unemployment, as opposed to just hoping they sort of show up for the programs. And so, for example, I'll be, before this spring is out, taking 2 or 3 job fairs out to the community, to communities where there is higher rates of unemployment, but not coincidentally, a lot of the people who live in those neighborhoods in the northwest and the northeast of the city are Black Canadians. And so we're going to be doing a host of things like that. We're going to be working with the province on the justice system to make sure that a lot of Black youth, for example, go into diversion programs wherever possible, so that instead of just going straight off, to jail on a first offense, they're actually given a chance to go into a diversion program which keeps them out of jail. And what we found in many cases with people who end up going to jail first time or sometimes even second time, is that it almost guarantees there's going to be a third and a fourth time, because if you don't sort of divert them off, and or say even when they do end up going to jail that you're going to do something productive with their time while they're there to help them finish school or whatever, that it's virtually guaranteed when they come out they're going to be left with no alternative but to hang out with some of the same people they hung out with before. So there's a whole host of things in the plan which I'd encourage you to read. I want to just assure you of one thing that was really important in all of this. This plan was not developed by a bunch of bureaucrats sitting at City Hall writing it up. What we did is we went out and had 41 different community consultations run by community groups. So we would say to a residents group in one of the neighborhoods that I was just talking about, or some of the groups within the Black community, you convene a group of people that are from your organization, your community. We will help direct the discussion only because we need to get some answers to certain questions, but you're going to supply the people with the opinions. And I went to 4 of them out of 41. They attracted hundreds of people in total. And I can tell you that when you sort of ask about the question of why anti-Black racism exists, I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, you could put it down to sort of saying, well, human nature has provided for racism to be a reality for, a long, long time, and up to and including today. But I think the bottom line is that we acknowledge that it exists today. But I heard something that sort of left a lasting impression on me, which I've talked about since, and it's going to fuel my own determination to see that this strategy is actually implemented. And that is that I heard mums sitting there, for example, telling me that I would find it hard to understand what it's like to be followed around a store. And I said, you're right, because I've never been followed around a store. Or they would say, it's hard for you to understand. They said this not directed at me necessarily, but directed to the people who are convening these discussions, that it's hard to understand the feeling that you have when you're driving along and you're stopped for what they call that offensive driving while Black, which is you weren't doing anything. And I said, you're right. I've been stopped before by the police when I was driving when I was speeding, so I understood why I was stopped. And I usually got a ticket for speeding. But I've never been stopped just for them kind of stopping and coming up to the side of the car and saying, well, we just thought we'd stop
That's what Marcy's article was about.
ask you a few questions.
Prominent Black woman stopped only because she was Black.
So, if you go through policing, you go through the justice system, you go through employment, you go through community activities, this is a plan that sets out various elements that we have to work on and that are funded for their initial year, and that we're going to be doing a lot of things with the provincial government because they too have a strategy and with substantial funding. And I hope it's going to make a real difference. But you know what? The difference will be measured at the end of the day on exactly the basis you put your question, which is the right way to put it. That gap in unemployment between post-secondary educated Black women and other women, it either reduces or it doesn't. And I'm not saying that you give up. If it doesn't, you then have to sort of probably regroup and try a different program. But the bottom line is that we've got to close that gap, and we've got to close the gap of incarceration of the dramatically increased percentage of Black young people in particular, but people of different ages that are in jail as opposed to those who are not. The dropout rate among Black high school students is far higher than for others. So those are all things that we can measure, and we're going to just have to work together to remedy that. And I think these programs. I just finished on this note. I was at the end of Black History Month was yesterday, and we have it every year. And people ask why, and I said, I've come to understand very well now that if you don't understand in the most diverse city in the world, which this is, if you don't understand the roots of everybody's going back, like all the way back into their ancestors and so on. It's the same with our Indigenous people. That's why it's so important we now understand the residential schools and the terrible scars that left. And I went to 3 remote Indigenous communities last year so that I could learn about it. And when I heard people telling me that they were taken away from their homes at age 4, they were taken to a school where they were not allowed to speak their Indigenous language, they were told their Indigenous culture was no longer a part of who they were, and then they would go home years later, not for the summer holidays. They would go home years later and couldn't speak to their own grandparents because they no longer could speak the Indigenous language. You realize that that doesn't just have an impact on you that year or in that generation. It has an impact for a long time to come. And the same is true with every community. It's not just the Black community and the Indigenous community. Everybody in this room, everybody in the most diverse city in the world, where 51% of the people who live here were born outside the country, have different ways. It's one of the challenges I face as a police board member. Everybody who comes from different countries has a different way of looking at the police. You know, I grew up in Toronto where they said to you, the policeman is your friend, or the police officer is your friend. But there's lots of places people come from where you don't grow up either having that told to you or experiencing that. And so as a result, you have a sort of and we have to sort of, you know, deal with that here. It's one of the responsibilities that goes with being the most diverse city in the world, is that you have to look at these things differently. But we're going to try with that program. I'm very determined with it, and if I'm given a second term, that will be the time during which we'll either implement it successfully and start to make progress on this, or we won't. But I'm confident we can, and we will, and I think we must.
In relation to much smaller issues which surrounds the King Street pilot project, I know that there's a lot of backlash surrounding this new development, but I think it's an absolutely fantastic idea to ease the number of cars on one of the busiest streets in Toronto. However, what do you think the long-term result of this project will be? And do you think the pilot project will be successful in the distant future?
I hope the pilot project will be successful, and you know, so far I would say if you look at the pilot project, and I hope again you're familiar with what the King Street pilot project is. Essentially, we limited the use of King Street by private automobiles, and we placed a high priority on transit. The King Street streetcar is the busiest surface route in Toronto. It, for example, carries way more passengers than the Shepherd subway line, and I think it's the 3rd busiest surface transit route in North America. And it was carrying 65,000 people a day, and as a result of the King Street pilot project, it is now carrying 84,000 people a day, which is one proof point that suggests it's working, because people who previously abandoned the streetcar on the basis they could walk faster, quite literally, people were saying they could walk faster than the streetcar, which is ridiculous, are now taking the streetcar. And so if you look at the principal objective of it, which was to move the transit vehicles faster by giving them priority on that corridor, out of all the places where cars, in fact, have more priority, it is working. The streetcar times are reduced for people traveling, and they will tell you that, and we're measuring it all. The streetcar reliability has been dramatically improved by upwards of 50%, and the streetcar usage, transit ridership, has improved on that line. The area, car traffic, by the way, I've taken over the time that you're looking at it, which has got to be the whole day, and we now have sophisticated electronic measuring in place in all of the downtown streets so we can look at it, has been affected to a tiny negative extent. Tiny. You know, we're talking about a very, very small addition to people's car travel time. And I can, again, attest to that on an anecdotal basis because I use those streets all the time. And, you know, look, in rush hour, streets are busy, but they're all busy everywhere, not just around King Street. The one area that has been of concern has been the impact it's had on some of the businesses down there. Again, even the data that we collected, and we bought, you have to buy it from a company called Moneris, which operates a lot of those terminals that you put your credit card or your debit card in, and they collect data on what the sales are 1 month versus another, 1 year versus another, and we bought that data so we could see what the data said. Now, it's imperfect because it doesn't represent 100% of the sales. It represents their market share, which is about 30%, but it gives you an inkling. And that data suggested that the sales weren't down, but I accept the fact that there are places on King Street that have suffered some loss in sales because maybe some of their clientele, for example, who were used to driving their cars and who were people that read about King Street and thought cars were banned or they couldn't park or whatever. So what we've been engaged in is a strenuous effort to promote through a media campaign, to use that ritual website some of you might have used to say if you go and eat at a place on King Street, you're going to get $15 off, to do various things. And then finally, I'll just mention what's coming in the spring. Because we effectively closed down the lane that was previously used for parking for traffic, so it's not used for parking or traffic anymore, there is space now in front of multiple places across the pilot project area, which we've put out to a design competition. And we've said to people, we either design a little parkette for us where people can just go there in the better weather and just chill out. We have 8 spots that will be for cafes, and so if you've been down to King Street when TIFF was on, you'll get an experience like that where you'll have cafes that'll be right out onto the street in front of some of the restaurants that have actually been having trouble with their business. And I think when the good weather comes, which is not that far away, hopefully, we're going to find that the attitudes and even the experience of King Street is going to be much more successful, in addition to the transit still moving faster. Like, you'll have that still happening, but you will also now have reasons why the businesses will be rejuvenated, and why it'll become the spot to go again, because you'll have these huge cafes that spill out into the street. And you will have traffic relatively unaffected by it. And to me, that's a win-win-win. But we do have the business challenge to look after, because some of them have been dislocated by this, and I acknowledge that. And we've been doing all kinds of things we've never done before to try and help them, and we'll continue to do that. And then we'll assess the pilot project at the end of the year. The other point that I've made is it was to be and is to be a 12-month pilot project. And when people were clamoring for me to shut it down, I mean, you've got to give it a fair chance. Up until last week, we only had 2 months of data out of 12. Now we have 3, and the data has been pretty consistent each of the first 3 months, but that's still only 3 out of 12 months. And we wanted to give this a fair try before we sort of either got it or abandoned it. We did, by the way, make a partial exemption for taxis between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m., which was meant to take account of the late night crowd that are downtown, so they could use taxis, so the taxis can now use the street during those hours.
Toronto is the only Canadian city to make the shortlist for Amazon's second headquarters. You showed great support in their decision, as you were the first to announce you wanted Toronto to be amongst its contenders when it opened bidding last year. Their presence in Toronto would result in an opening of many job opportunities, more investment, and tax revenue for Toronto. However, there's been some controversy suggesting that if they were to pick Toronto, it would result in a long-term employment disaster. Business leaders have expressed concern over the potential of Amazon stealing crucial employees. Canadian-based startups are worried they will not be able to compete with this tech giant. There is a fear our talented citizens, along with their developments, will be shipped overseas, losing any economic value we had hoped to create. What's your opinion on the matter?
Well, I don't share that fear, partly because of the decision we made as to what would be the centerpiece of our bid. And it was very interesting, and I think it was courageous, and I think it was smart, and I think it's one of the reasons that we're a contender today, as opposed to other American cities which decided to offer up these huge checks to Amazon, which last time I checked don't really need money from, they're doing pretty well. They don't need money from taxpayers in Toronto to help them along. And a lot of the cities in the U.S. offer huge checks and said, well, in some cases they've said that some cities might have offered. We were one of only 2 cities out of 238 that started to bid that made our bid public from day one, and other cities didn't. But we're told there are bids that contain like $1 billion of offered money. And the reason we bid on behalf of the Toronto region, but all the mayors and the other people involved in the bid felt that it was not sensible to bid $1 billion or any other such number, because then what do you do with the next company that wants to come here? Do you give them $1 billion too, and on it goes? What we did, which I would think you would endorse because you are going to be some of the beneficiaries of it, and even your children, is we said we were going to invest in the STEM education in particular, like in particular science and technology education, to increase the number of spaces that existed in our universities here in Ontario, to fill up the pipeline with more talent coming out, so that even if you had, and in a way I would say, look, this is a good problem to have 50,000 jobs that are looking for people to fill them. But what we want to make sure of is that we don't get into exactly the situation you described, or that some of these business people have described, which is that we sort of suck up all the available talent to fill up the Amazon jobs. And so by doing what our bid had as its centerpiece, and it's one of the great advantages to the Canadian system of post-secondary education, where it's effectively run and financed by the government and you as the students, but it allows the government to sort of pull a lever like that and say, we are going to make this investment in additional science and technology graduates, so that we're really remaining at the forefront of how much talent we have. And that's our biggest asset we put forward, by the way. We have here, and I don't just say it because I'm the mayor here or because we're all sitting here in Toronto, the talent pool that exists here on things like machine learning and artificial intelligence and so on is amazing. It is the best in the world. It is the best in the world. The guy from Google, and that's another somewhat controversial subject, but they're coming here to do something, and he said if I was Amazon, I wouldn't even bother to conduct the competition. I'd just come to Toronto because of what we have here, both in terms of our talent pool, but also in terms of our quality of life. Because the quality of life here is second to none. I think you know that. It's not perfect. So I would just say that I think there's going to be plenty of talent available. And I believe the other thing that's going for us is we're going to sort of reverse what's been going on here. If you look at Waterloo and Ryerson and U of T, there's been a bit of a brain drain where the American companies come up here and recruit. There are presently today 200,000 Canadians, most of them graduates of our universities, working in the Silicon Valley. Why? Because they felt there wasn't adequate opportunity up here, and somebody offered them a job, and that's fine. But I'd like to now think some of those people are going to come back because of the quality of life here, because of the cost of living in Silicon Valley, which is horrific if you know anybody who works and lives down there, because of our health care system. And the other advantage we're going to have, and again, I made a pitch today on CNBC in the United States about why Toronto should be picked. We have an open immigration system here, as we all know. And you know, if you contrast that with what's going on elsewhere, I mean, we are saying we want the best and the brightest to come here and join everybody else who's come here from around the world. And we have a system now that allows you to bring in talent in weeks from other parts of the world to say, you can come here and you can work here, and you can be admitted here in pretty short order. And so I acknowledge that concern. It's a valid concern, but I think that our bid addressed it. And I'll put the flip side for 1 second because it's very short. I don't think that it would have been very well received if I, as the mayor of Toronto, and my fellow mayors in the region had just said, we're not going to bother trying to bid for 50,000 jobs. I mean, you know, so we'll see what happens. I think politics makes it challenging for us to win it because we're a Canadian city and all the others are American and it's an American company and all the what's going on down there. But, you know, we're putting our best foot forward and we're competing hard to try and win as many of those jobs as we can get.
My question for you is, what was the most difficult or controversial decision that you've had to make since you've been in office, and how did you arrive at that decision?
Well, I'm not sure there's one single decision that I can point to, but the most difficult issue that I faced since I've been in office is the homelessness issue. Because I acknowledge the existence of a problem. I acknowledge the existence of a problem that has been growing. It's been growing for a number of reasons. I mentioned one earlier on, but I didn't mean to single it out for attention, but I just stated a fact to you, which is that, you know, 30% of the people in our shelters are refugees. But there are other things that are happening that are causing people to be seriously dislocated, and I think some of that, again, has to do with something else I mentioned, mental health and addiction. But you know, and it's one of those things where you sort of know what you have to do, which is both to do some things in the short term, but also, much more importantly, do some things in the long term. And, you know, there was quite a bit of controversy towards the end of last year about exactly what we should do and where and when vis-a-vis shelters. It comes down to a sort of a very, what's the word I'm looking for, a very demanding sort of decision that you have to make and try to get it right, as between what you do that is short-term measures to make sure people are protected while they're dislocated, but really trying to look for and finance long-term solutions. Because the long-term solution to the homelessness issue starts with, I guess, in terms of the two biggest categories of people that need to be helped based on current stats. Number one, first and foremost, probably is supportive housing for those who are mentally ill or have addiction issues, where presently in this country and in this province, they really don't have any place to go to get that support. And supportive housing isn't referred necessarily to a building. It refers to the fact that you could even live in a normal apartment, perhaps on a subsidized basis, but that you have someone who comes to look in on you and provide you with some support. Or you even have a place to go during the day to get that support because you're getting over a mental illness or dealing with a post-addiction or a current addiction problem. So supportive housing doesn't necessarily mean you have a whole building, you know, that is filled with people who are in some kind of special apartments. It really just means that you have support. And then the second part of it is, you know, to find a way to sort of, for example, rehouse and house in an integrated way into the community the refugee population that is presently in shelters. If you just took those two groups and you know, had them go to what is more appropriate accommodation for them, you would have a lot of the pressure taken off the shelter system because you'd have hundreds of people who, you know, would not be there. And then finally, the supply of affordable housing. And I referred earlier on to the fact that there were years when we basically built no new units of affordable housing or approved no new units before I was mayor. And we just can't go on in a way like that, where you have a city that's growing as fast as this one is, and is just not increasing its supply of affordable rental housing. And so That's been the toughest issue because you know, there's no sort of, there's no answer that sort of solves the problem right away. And there's this difficult sort of calibration that goes on between what you need to do in the short term to make sure people don't find themselves on the street, but at the same time not sort of allocating too much of that money for something that really isn't the right long-term answer. And so it's the toughest issue.
So as per an article written by Toronto Star, during your 300-day campaign in 2014, you had introduced 45 promises which would be fulfilled during your time in office. 18 of these promises were fulfilled, one of them being an ambassador for youth employment. You effectively doubled the number of companies participating in the youth employment program and received a $8.6 million boost from the federal government. The Youth Corps program, which helps youth between the ages of 16 to 29 find employment, creates a large number of job opportunities and connects the City of Toronto to private sector partners. However, upon graduation, many students are faced with a lack of job opportunities and companies that are willing to hire new grads. Given this, what advice do you have for young students like us who will be entering the workforce soon?
Well, first of all, the commitment that I made was to double the number of companies and therefore the number of job opportunities that existed in this program we had that had a huge track record of success, and that the people who came through the program ended up with permanent jobs at the end of it, because it was meant for people who had finished with a degree of their education and were ready to come into the workforce but found it difficult to access the workforce. And in fact, we've tripled the number of companies, so we've exceeded the promise. And I should say, by the way, I don't, sort of fuss about these things much, but when they wrote up that I'd kept 18 promises, it meant that I'd kept those in whole, but they said that there were another number, I forget, quite a significant number that were in progress, because you set an objective. For example, I said I would double the amount of the budget for tree planting, and at the time that article was written, I hadn't doubled the budget from the first year I was in office, but now that our final budget of this term has been brought in fact, I will have doubled the budget for tree planting, which is something that's important to the maintenance of the tree canopy and the environment in the City of Toronto. So, these articles are measured at a point in time, and they sort of had the headline 18 promises kept, whereas there were another substantial number, I don't remember the number, that were in progress, and those I think you are governed or judged on at the end of your time. My advice to you would be to come and take advantage of programs like this. These programs exist for people like yourselves who are, for a lot of people, while they've got a great education, they don't find it easy, because it isn't easy nowadays to access employment. I was saying just yesterday at something else that, while the internet is wonderful because it allows you to submit your resume electronically as opposed to having to find your way to somebody's office and hand it in or mail it in or whatever, I'm sure many of you have had the experience that some of my own kids have had, which is, well, they send their resume in and they just never hear back anything. Like, there's not even, you email it in and there's not even, well, sometimes there's an auto reply, but that's all you ever get. And then you never hear another thing, whatever happened to it. Did they lose it or did it? And so one of the things I'm doing, as I mentioned earlier on, we're continuing to expand that program. That is the one that puts you into employment and has led to permanent employment. What it's really meant to do is give you a trial period of employment with some significant employers. And it gives you the experience, it trains you to do the interviews, it helps you with all that kind of thing. But then it's the employment period that gives you the on-the-ground experience. And in many cases, I think the success rate is about 80%. The people actually get hired permanently by the companies that take them in under this program. And we do a lot of the sort of work of helping people to get ready to go and get these jobs. We're also going to take these job fairs out, and I'd suggest, I've seen a list on my own sort of schedule looking ahead of 6 major job fairs that are going on, where you have employers with hundreds of jobs. And yes, some of them are jobs you wouldn't necessarily, given your education, be interested in pursuing because they're jobs in retail or whatever, but a lot of them are other kinds of jobs that you might be interested in. And then the final thing that I'd say is network. And I say this to people, the most valuable thing I did in terms of advancing my own career, I didn't do it for this reason, but I'm just telling you it's an ancillary benefit, but a big one, is that I got myself involved, and Ralph was mentioning this, when I was very young, in all kinds of organizations, including politics. In politics, I met people that were senior people in every walk of life, and I knew them on a first-name basis when I was 19 years old. And just because I knew them because I'd worked on campaigns with them. Because political campaigns, they take anybody who walks in the door, and it's a mix of people from the highest CEO to the person who's completely unemployed. Charitable organizations are much the same. If you have an interest in an interest group or a charity, you will find when you walk in, first of all, they'll never turn you away. They will say, look, we're delighted to have you here. They're always short of volunteers for whatever the work is. And lo and behold, you will end up meeting somebody that you work alongside for the Cancer Society or an environmental group or whatever, who happens to be a person that'll say, well, gee, I've been looking for somebody like you. Why don't you come on down to my office next week, when you met them in a circumstance that's out of context. And I would say to you, if there was the number one piece of advice that I would offer to people who are obviously bright, people that have this tremendous educational opportunity, it is get involved in a bunch of other things, because that is where you will meet the people that you will provide you with opportunity, or they'll introduce you to somebody who's a friend of theirs who does. And the second thing would be, so beyond that, the second thing would be to not be afraid of creating a job. What's happening in your generation, and I was luckier, I guess Ralph and I both were, in that the tradition, I'm a lawyer as well by profession, and the tradition then was you went to law school and you came out and you were a lawyer for 30 or 40 years and then you retired. And it was just sort of accepted there were enough jobs for all the law graduates and every other kind of graduate there was. Now there aren't. And it's partly because the world of work has changed, and they call it sort of precarious work, but what it really is that employers and people are now hiring people on a kind of an as-needed basis on assignments, and it's caused people to have to acquire a skill that is different. It's not a skill at learning how to get a job, it's a skill at learning how to create a job. And if I knew the number of young people now that I would meet, and you probably have friends that have done this, they've gone out and set up their own small businesses, and a lot of the tech startups have done this, and they've succeeded probably beyond their wildest dreams. It's risky, takes a bit of courage to do it, but I think the premium is placed now on your ability to create a job for yourself and maybe for other people than it is on just getting a job. And if you look, there's all kinds of needs to be met out there by smart people who are willing to work hard, but it isn't the same anymore in terms of just getting a job in a law firm or a company or a bank. And so those are two things I would say. Don't be afraid to be an entrepreneur, and you can ask for help. Ask for help. People, I've never turned down anybody who came and asked me for help in the context of saying, would you sit down with me for an hour and give me your advice? I'll bet you Ralph hasn't either, because you're delighted that people ask you, and I had people help me. But ask for help. Don't be afraid to be an entrepreneur. Don't be afraid to change careers. I've changed careers radically, like 4 or 5 times, and I had no idea. I went to do a talk show, for goodness sake. If you said to me when I was in law school, did I ever think I was going to do a talk show? I would have said no, both because I had no idea what you had to do a talk show. I had to learn how to do it. But I thought it would be fun. And I figured if they were asking me, they figured I had the wherewithal to figure out how to do it. And I became very successful at it because I figured it sounded like fun, and it was. But don't be afraid to do something very different than what you thought you might do. But come to this program, because what it does, what it does more than anything else? It gives you the self-confidence of knowing that they'll help you to get through interviews, help you to get interviews, help you to get that first opportunity to work, and then you'll have proven yourself by that stage, and you'll have the self-confidence of knowing you can do whatever you want.
Okay, on behalf of Ryerson, I want to thank Mayor Tory, and I want to say something. John Tory is the best mayor Toronto's ever had, and I want every one of you, I want 100% of you voting in the next election, voting for Tory and delivering your family. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you very much.